In a world where civilizations often measure their significance by the breadth of their empires, the size of their armies, or the wealth of their resources, the story of the Jewish people defies conventional metrics. With a population just over 15 million today, less than a fraction of a percent of the global total, their historical and cultural impact appears disproportionately vast. Compared to other influential ethnic groups like the Chinese, Anglo-Saxons, Italians, or Germans, each numbering in the hundreds of millions and possessing sprawling diasporas, the Jewish presence seems numerically insignificant, and yet their influence on religion, science, philosophy, economics, and even the very frameworks through which societies understand morality and law is immense. It's easy to dismiss this as a statistical fluke, but the reality is far more complex. The Jews have not simply survived history, they have shaped it, often from the margins. Born in the deserts of the ancient Middle East, over 4 millennia ago, their journey has taken them across continents, through exiles and returns, persecution and revival. What makes this even more extraordinary is that they have maintained a coherent identity through it all, ethnically, culturally, and spiritually. Where countless other ancient peoples have faded into obscurity, their names preserved only in archaeology, the Jews have endured. The question isn't merely how they've lasted, but how they've remained so relevant. To understand that one must look beyond the numbers and into the fabric of a civilization built not on territorial conquest, but on ideas. Ideas so enduring that they reshaped the world's understanding of divinity, justice, and community. Their history is not merely a story of survival, but a blueprint for resilience, built on principles rather than empires, and rooted in the power of memory, law, and belief. The roots of this enduring identity trace back to one of history's most enigmatic patriarchs, Abraham. While once viewed as a purely mythical figure, modern genetics has lent unexpected support to the idea of his existence, with Y chromosome studies among Jews and Arabs indicating a shared male ancestor around the time and region traditionally associated with Abraham. Whether literal or symbolic, Abraham's narrative sets the tone for the Jewish experience. A man called to leave a decaying civilization in Uruk and follow an invisible, singular God into an uncertain future. From this departure sprang not only a religion but a new model for what it meant to be a people. The Jews didn't found their identity in territory or kingship, but in covenant, an agreement of faith, law, and purpose that transcended borders. As they journeyed through the ancient world, first as nomads, then as captives, exiles, and minorities in powerful empires, they developed a unique societal structure grounded in religious texts, oral tradition, and communal memory. Their earliest records position them on the edges of the dominant Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations, surviving not by power, but by adaptability. This marginal status forced them to innovate socially and spiritually, producing one of the earliest examples of a people bound more by shared values than by land or blood. Their identity became portable, a kind of cultural arc they carried across deserts, rivers, and centuries. This unusual strategy, survival through separation, unity through law, allowed them to outlast and outthink many of the mighty nations that once ruled over them. It laid the groundwork for a civilization that would, against all odds, preserve its uniqueness while deeply influencing the moral and intellectual course of human history. By the way, before we dive deeper, I want to share something with you. This channel has a goal: 1,000 subscribers by June 30th. It may seem like a small number compared to the billions out there, just like the Jewish people themselves. But, as we've seen, small numbers can carry big impact. If you're enjoying the journey so far, consider subscribing and helping us reach that milestone together. The uniqueness of Jewish civilization lies not only in its survival, but in how it maintained internal cohesion across thousands of years, without centralized power or a stable homeland. In most historical contexts, a people without sovereignty or a shared geography eventually dissolve into the cultures that surround them. The Jews, however, constructed a societal framework so robust and internally reinforcing that it could withstand centuries of dispersion, persecution, and transformation. This was largely achieved through the central role of religion, not merely as a set of beliefs, but as a totalizing structure that governed personal behavior, social norms, education, diet, timekeeping, and law. Jewish monotheism was radical in its day. In a world ruled by polytheistic empires and cultic rituals, the insistence on one invisible, omnipotent, and morally demanding God seemed not just heretical, but dangerous. Yet this uncompromising belief became the cornerstone of their identity, reinforcing a sense of purpose and unity wherever they lived. Through their prophets and priests, the Jews developed not only spiritual doctrine, but also a deep tradition of self-critique, ethical reflection, and communal accountability. Their sacred texts did not glorify their own people uncritically. Instead, they documented failure, rebellion, punishment, and redemption. In doing so, they created a living memory, a dynamic narrative that could adapt to shifting historical circumstances while still anchoring the Jewish sense of self. While surrounding empires celebrated conquest and splendor, Jewish literature preserved lamentation, law, and covenant, forming a collective consciousness that transcended borders. It's no coincidence that Judaism gave birth to two of the world's largest religions, Christianity and Islam. Its foundational ideas of justice, monotheism, moral responsibility, and the sacredness of life reshaped civilizations from Rome to Mecca and beyond, influencing the ethical scaffolding of billions. Still, the Jews' ability to maintain cultural continuity amid relentless adversity wasn't achieved through faith alone. Their survival strategy required something more intricate, a powerful combination of intellectual rigor, communal solidarity, and strategic adaptability. Over centuries, they crafted an education system that emphasized literacy, debate, and memory, often anchored in the intense study of religious texts. This emphasis on knowledge created a culture where scholarship was not a luxury of the elite, but a communal expectation, extending to the poorest and most marginalized members. Rabbinic leadership emerged not through birthright or force, but through demonstrated wisdom and interpretive authority, reinforcing a meritocratic element within their social structure. These scholars acted as both spiritual leaders and legal arbiters, interpreting evolving conditions through the lens of eternal principles. This adaptability allowed Jewish communities to function semi-autonomously within larger, often hostile societies. In medieval Europe, ghettos became centers of learning and communal governance, even as they were enforced by external decree. In the Muslim world, Jews were granted limited autonomy under dhimmi status, managing their own internal affairs with remarkable organization. What bound these disparate communities together across time and geography was not a centralized institution, but a shared commitment to Torah, Talmud, and the sacred rhythms of Jewish life. Whether in Baghdad or Krakow, Jews marked time the same way, observed the same dietary laws, told the same stories, and mourned the same exiles. This spiritual and cultural infrastructure allowed them to rebuild after each devastation, from Babylonian exile to Roman conquest to the Inquisition. Even the darkest chapters in their history became threads in a narrative of endurance. Their collective memory was forged not just in triumphs, but in the tenacity to endure defeat without surrendering their soul. To better understand how the Jews were perceived in the ancient world, it's useful to compare them with modern analogues, communities that, like the early Israelites, maintained strong internal cohesion while appearing alien to the broader societies around them. One such parallel is the Mormons in the United States. Originating during the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century, the Mormon movement began with a small group of believers who embraced a radically different theological framework and endured suspicion, persecution, and eventual displacement. Like the Jews, they migrated westward, establishing a distinct identity in the deserts of Utah and forming a quasi-theocratic society centered on religious law, moral discipline, and communal cooperation. Their emphasis on self-sufficiency, large families, and strict codes of conduct bears striking resemblance to the ways ancient Jewish communities structured themselves for survival. Both groups were seen as strange, even cultish, yet simultaneously admired for their resilience and moral clarity. In a similar vein, Jewish communities in antiquity maintained practices that their polytheistic neighbors found bizarre: circumcision, monotheism, dietary restrictions, and Sabbath observance among them. But these practices weren't merely spiritual disciplines. They functioned as psychological and social filters. Adherence to such rituals signaled commitment, built trust within the group, and acted as a barrier against assimilation. In the volatile geopolitical landscape of the ancient Near East, where conquest and subjugation were constants, these ritual codes forged an internal strength that outlasted many imperial armies. Jewish distinctiveness, often misunderstood as arrogance or isolationism, was in reality a defense mechanism, an evolved response to the relentless pressure of external threats. And it worked. Despite centuries of conquest and dispersion, their culture not only survived, but spread its core ideas across continents and civilizations, reshaping human consciousness in its wake. Geography played a pivotal role in shaping the Jewish experience. The land of Israel, nestled between Africa, Asia, and Europe, has historically been one of the most invaded and contested regions on Earth. Positioned at the crossroads of empires, it was both a blessing and a curse. While its location offered access to trade routes and cultural exchange, it also made it a perpetual battleground. Surrounded by powerful neighbors, the Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, the Jews faced an almost continuous struggle for sovereignty. With limited capacity to match the military might of their adversaries, they turned inward, developing spiritual, legal, and social strategies to preserve their identity under foreign domination. Religion, in this context, became not just a path to the divine, but a form of resistance. By transforming obedience to God into the highest form of loyalty, Jewish leaders crafted a system where defiance against assimilation was sanctified. The Torah became more than a religious text. It was a constitution for a stateless nation. Laws regarding food, clothing, sexual ethics, and ritual purity created a lifestyle that inherently distanced Jews from surrounding cultures, ensuring that even in dispersion they would remain distinct. This spiritual insulation, though often criticized or attacked, became the bedrock of their durability. Moreover, their legalistic approach to faith fostered an environment of constant questioning and interpretation, traits that would later fuel remarkable intellectual advancements. This inward-focused model, where cultural survival did not depend on land, armies, or kings, allowed Jewish identity to be transported across oceans and centuries. It created a civilization that could thrive even in exile, with its strongest institutions located not in capitals or temples, but in the mind and memory of its people. Perhaps one of the most striking features of Jewish history is how it turned adversity into a vehicle for intellectual refinement. While most ancient societies glorified conquest, wealth, and the power of kings, the Jewish narrative took a radically different approach, one rooted in introspection, ethical responsibility, and divine accountability. In a time when Assyrian rulers boasted of mass torture and Roman emperors turned executions into entertainment, the Hebrew prophets emerged as voices of dissent, calling not only their enemies, but their own people to moral reform. These prophets weren't sycophants of power, they were critics of their own communities, warning of the dangers of inequality, idolatry, and corruption. They wrote of justice rolling down like waters, of the responsibility to care for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. This ethical framework, so far ahead of its time, laid the foundation for future civilizations to reconsider what it meant to be good, just, and human. The culture that emerged from this prophetic tradition became one deeply attuned to self-examination, turning history itself into a tool for moral education. Their sacred texts were filled with stories of failure and redemption, of kings punished for arrogance and nations destroyed for abandoning a virtue. Unlike many ancient civilizations that erased defeats from their records, the Jews preserved them, studied them, and built from them. This cycle of falling and rising instilled a national character marked by humility and resilience. Rather than crushing them, failure became a forge that hardened their will and sharpened their collective intelligence. Over centuries, this led to the cultivation of a highly literate, analytical society. The emphasis on education wasn't accidental. It was a cultural imperative, a way to preserve their legacy and empower each new generation to carry it forward. In this way, adversity didn't break Jewish civilization, it refined it. This enduring culture of learning would ultimately become one of the defining traits of the Jewish people, shaping their role in nearly every society they entered. From ancient Babylon to modern Europe, Jewish communities were often barred from land ownership and excluded from political power, yet they thrived through intellectual pursuits, craftsmanship, and commerce. This was not due to some genetic predisposition, as stereotypes have often suggested, but rather a deliberate cultural investment in education, critical thinking, and adaptability. In rabbinic circles, scholarly achievement was a path to respect and influence, regardless of wealth or lineage. Children were expected to study from a young age, often mastering complex texts in Hebrew and Aramaic, while their peers in other cultures were illiterate. This intense educational environment fostered not only religious knowledge, but also skills in logic, rhetoric, and philosophy, skills that would later prove invaluable as Jews navigated the ever-shifting politics of diaspora life. Their mental discipline, honed over generations of Talmudic debate and legal interpretation, made them effective doctors, financiers, scientists, and writers. It's no coincidence that despite comprising less than 0.2% of the world's population, Jews have received a disproportionate share of Nobel Prizes in literature, economics, and the sciences. This intellectual prominence is not a fluke. It is the product of millennia of prioritizing study as a sacred act. Yet even this achievement has been double-edged. In many periods of history, the success of Jewish individuals bred envy and suspicion. Their accomplishments were interpreted not as the fruits of diligence, but as evidence of conspiracy, leading to waves of discrimination and violence. Still, Jewish communities persisted, often responding to persecution not with retreat, but with renewed vigor in their cultural mission. Their belief in the value of knowledge as a weapon, a shield, and a light remained unshaken. The remarkable consistency with which Jewish communities have rebuilt themselves after disasters speaks to a foundational principle within their civilization: the ability to turn trauma into transformation. Time and again, the Jewish people have faced existential threats, destruction of their temples, mass exiles, forced conversions, pogroms, and genocides, yet each time they emerged with their identity not only intact, but often revitalized. The Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, for instance, could have marked the end of Jewish history. Instead, it catalyzed the development of a rich diaspora culture, the consolidation of sacred texts, and the formation of synagogues and schools as portable centers of religious life. Likewise, after the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, in 70 CE, Jewish leadership transitioned from priests to rabbis, shifting the locus of authority from the temple to the Torah. This adaptability, rooted in a theology that embraces questioning, interpretation, and evolution, has allowed Judaism to flourish in nearly every environment, from the deserts of North Africa to the intellectual salons of Europe. But it wasn't just theological resilience that ensured their survival. It was also an intentional strategy of boundary maintenance. Jewish law created clear lines between insiders and outsiders, and while this sometimes led to accusations of separateness or exclusivity, it was also the key to preserving community cohesion in hostile environments. The Jewish people made themselves hard to assimilate, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. In a world where assimilation often meant erasure, maintaining difference was an act of survival, and so Jewish life became a complex dance between engagement and preservation, participating in broader societies while fiercely guarding the integrity of their own traditions. In this sense, every exile became a classroom, every loss a lesson, and every displacement a new beginning. Nowhere is the strength of Jewish cultural memory more evident than in their sacred literature. Unlike most ancient civilizations, whose mythologies and epics glorified conquest and divine favoritism, the Hebrew Bible paints a far more complex and introspective picture. It is a narrative full of flawed heroes, moral ambiguity, and divine justice that spares no one, not even the chosen. Figures like King David are celebrated not just for their triumphs, but for their failures and repentance. The Jewish scriptures form a living archive of human struggle, divine expectation, and national introspection. They chronicle not only triumphs but sins, not only miracles but massacres, and always with an eye toward ethical reckoning. This honesty created a moral framework that transcended tribalism and eventually served as a template for Western legal and ethical systems. Through books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, Jewish law encoded concepts of justice, compassion, and personal responsibility that would influence Christianity, Islam, and secular humanism alike. But these texts also served another function. They were a portable homeland. In times when land and sovereignty were stripped away, the Torah remained a source of unity and guidance. Whether studied in a Babylonian yeshiva, a Spanish synagogue, or a Polish shtetl, it connected Jews across time and space through a shared narrative and legal tradition. Its laws dictated daily life, while its stories reinforced a collective identity rooted in struggle and divine purpose. The Bible was not just a spiritual guide. It was a survival manual, a constitution, and a diary of national consciousness. In this way, Jewish memory became more than recollection. It became a mechanism for endurance. Through its sacred texts, the Jewish people carried their nation on their backs, rebuilding it wherever they were scattered, one page at a time. If this story is resonating with you, if you're finding meaning in how resilience and knowledge have shaped entire civilizations, I'd love it if you could give this video a like and follow the channel. Your support helps keep stories like this alive, just like oral traditions passed from generation to generation. Over the centuries, as Jews migrated across continents and settled in diverse cultures, from Persia to Poland, Morocco to Manhattan, they developed intricate networks of diaspora communities that preserved core traditions while adapting to local conditions. These communities, often isolated and subjected to external constraints, became microcosms of Jewish life, self-governed, spiritually rich, and bound by a deep sense of mutual responsibility. The concept of kehillah, or community, wasn't just a social arrangement. It was a miniature world where religious law, education, welfare, and Justice all functioned under a unified moral code. These tight-knit enclaves, sometimes voluntary, sometimes imposed as ghettos, fostered resilience through internal solidarity. Within them, Jews organized systems of charity, arbitration, schooling, and ritual observance that could function even in the absence of civil rights or state protection. Ironically, the very marginalization they experienced often made their internal institutions stronger. Deprived of land ownership or participation in broader political life, they became masters of trade, finance, and intellectual endeavor. In many cases, Jewish communities had higher literacy rates and more equitable access to education than the societies that surrounded them. And while this exceptionalism frequently led to suspicion or resentment, it also equipped Jews with tools for survival and influence. In cities like Amsterdam, Salonika, and later New York, Jewish immigrants rapidly built flourishing cultural centers by drawing on centuries of communal organization and shared values. Across generations, the Jewish diaspora became less of a fragmentation and more of a web, each node connected by texts, traditions, and memory. This web functioned like a global nervous system, capable of transmitting knowledge, money, and messages across great distances. And crucially, it kept Jewish identity alive, even when surrounded by hostile or indifferent cultures that sought to erase it. But with adaptation came tension. The very tools that preserved Jewish identity in exile sometimes became obstacles in the face of modernization. As the Enlightenment spread across Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, bringing with it ideals of rationalism, secularism, and individual liberty, many Jews were both inspired and unsettled. For some, the promise of citizenship, access to universities, and professional freedom was intoxicating. They began to shed traditional dress, study European philosophy, and seek integration into the broader society. This movement, known as the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, produced brilliant thinkers such as Moses Mendelssohn, who argued that Judaism could coexist with modernity. But for others, especially in Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire, such integration was seen as a threat to the very fabric of Jewish survival. The tension between tradition and assimilation became a defining conflict of modern Jewish history. Families were split, communities fractured, and debates raged over what it meant to be Jewish in a rapidly changing world. This internal struggle was compounded by the fact that even as Jews sought acceptance, they were often met with new forms of exclusion. Anti-Semitism evolved from medieval religious prejudice into modern racial theories that cast Jews as inherently alien, regardless of belief or behavior. In places like Germany and Russia, Jewish success was viewed not as evidence of integration, but as a menace to national identity. Thus, Jews found themselves in a paradox, too foreign to be fully accepted, yet too integrated to retreat into the past. Out of this tension arose new political and cultural movements: Zionism, socialism, Bundism, and later psychoanalysis and critical theory, all attempts to redefine Jewish identity in the modern world. These were not mere ideologies, but existential answers to a people asking, how do we survive now? Among the most transformative of these modern movements was Zionism, the idea that the Jewish people, after centuries of exile, should reclaim a sovereign homeland. Sparked by rising anti-Semitism in Europe and fueled by the limitations of assimilation, Zionism was both a political project and a spiritual reckoning. Theodor Herzl, often considered its father, envisioned a state where Jews could live freely, safely, and proudly as Jews, without needing to apologize or disguise themselves. But Zionism was never a monolith. It encompassed secular nationalists, religious messianists, socialists and pragmatists, all united by the dream of return. The early pioneers, or Chalutzim, who settled in Ottoman and later British-controlled Palestine, faced harsh conditions, hostile neighbors, and internal ideological rifts. Yet they laid the foundations of a new society, farming land long neglected, reviving Hebrew as a living language, and establishing institutions that would become the framework of the modern Israeli state. For many Jews around the world, especially after the horrors of the Holocaust, Israel represented not just a refuge, but a rebirth, a chance to be actors in their own destiny rather than perpetual guests in someone else's land. However, the creation of Israel also opened a new chapter of conflict. It introduced a moral and political complexity that continues to this day, particularly concerning the displacement and aspirations of the Palestinian people. For Jews, the tension between historical justice and modern political reality has become another layer in the ever-evolving question of identity. Israel is not merely a country, it is a mirror reflecting the hopes, fears, and contradictions of Jewish history. It is a place where ancient texts meet cutting-edge technology, where Holocaust survivors built cities, and where centuries of prayer for return became real, with all the joy and all the consequences that come with that fulfillment. The founding of Israel did not erase the diaspora. Instead, it reshaped its meaning. For the first time, in 2 millennia, the Jewish people had two centers, one in their ancestral land, the other dispersed across the globe. This duality brought both strength and dissonance. In the United States, for example, the post-war era saw an unprecedented flowering of Jewish life. Freed from the horrors of European anti-Semitism and bolstered by America's meritocratic promise, Jews rose rapidly in academia, media, finance, and the arts. They became visible not as victims, but as contributors to the national narrative. Jewish humor, intellect, and creativity infused American culture from Broadway to Hollywood to Wall Street. But as success grew, so did the anxiety of losing identity through comfort and assimilation. Many American Jews began to drift from religious observance, replacing synagogue attendance with cultural pride or political activism. The trauma of the past remained, but the rituals that once held communities together began to erode. Intermarriage rates climbed, Hebrew fluency declined, and the connection to Israel became more complicated, especially among younger generations shaped by different social values. Meanwhile, in Israel, Jewish identity took on a very different flavor, rooted in land, language, and the responsibilities of sovereignty. The kibbutznik and the IDF soldier replaced the rabbi and the scholar as cultural archetypes. This divergence created a widening gap in how Jews understood themselves as a religious community in exile or as a nation in charge of its destiny. The tensions between secular and religious, diaspora and homeland, tradition and innovation became fault lines not only within Israel but across the Jewish world. Yet, even in this fragmented state, the Jewish people continued to ask the same question that has echoed for generations. What does it mean to be Jewish now? That question of identity, purpose, and continuity has taken on new urgency in the 21st century. In a time marked by hyperconnectivity, cultural homogenization, and ideological polarization, the Jewish experience once again offers both a warning and a roadmap. On one hand, the forces of secularism and modernity have accelerated the erosion of traditional structures. In much of the diaspora, synagogue attendance has dwindled, religious knowledge is often shallow, and many Jews identify more with social causes or heritage tourism than with Torah or Talmud. The safety and prosperity that Jews have found in places like North America have, paradoxically, bred a sense of complacency and disconnection. Without the unifying threat of persecution or the binding power of shared ritual, Jewish life risks becoming diffuse, reduced to cultural markers and historical nostalgia. On the other hand, There are powerful countercurrents, revitalized communities centered around Orthodox practice, growing interest in Jewish mysticism and philosophy, and a resurgence of Hebrew learning among young people seeking a deeper connection to their roots. In Israel, the tension between secular governance and religious tradition continues to spark fierce debates, but also innovative syntheses. High-tech startups operate alongside yeshivas, and national identity is negotiated not in theoretical terms, but through the lived realities of war, politics, and faith. Around the world, Jews continue to write, argue, build, and create, drawing from a wellspring of collective memory that spans continents and millennia. The Jewish story is not a static tale of survival, but a dynamic conversation between past and future. It asks hard questions and refuses easy answers. In doing so, it offers not just a way of understanding one people, but a lens through which to view the challenges and possibilities of the modern world. At its core, the Jewish civilization has been shaped by a profound relationship with time, not just in the sense of history, but in how it sacralizes memory, ritual, and anticipation. The weekly observance of Shabbat, for instance, is more than a day of rest. It is a weekly rehearsal of cosmic order, a resistance against the tyranny of productivity. Jewish holidays are not mere commemorations, but reenactments that collapse past and present. Passover is not simply about the Exodus, but a reminder that every generation must see itself as personally leaving Egypt. This cyclical rhythm creates a consciousness where time is not linear but layered, where the traumas of exile and the joys of return coexist in the same breath. Such a worldview fosters both humility and hope. It teaches that history is not destiny, that exile can end, and that redemption is always possible, even if deferred. This temporal awareness has also made Jews particularly attuned to change. They have been among the first to notice when empires begin to rot, when ideologies ossify, when societies betray their own principles. This sensitivity has sometimes made them prophetic and sometimes made them scapegoats, but it has also made them survivors. In a world obsessed with novelty, Jewish tradition insists on remembering. In a world that worships power, it elevates wisdom. In a world fragmented by identity politics, it offers a model of identity built not on exclusion, but on covenant and continuity. As civilizations rise and fall, the Jewish people persist, not as an empire, but as a testament. Their survival is not just about resilience, but about relevance, an ongoing insistence that meaning can be found, that justice matters, and that the human story is still being written. Perhaps what sets Jewish history apart most vividly is how suffering has been transformed into spiritual and philosophical depth rather than despair. In a world where trauma often fractures identity and perpetuates cycles of vengeance or victimhood, the Jewish response has been markedly different. Across centuries, the Jewish people have taken tragedy, whether exile, persecution, or genocide, and repurposed it into rituals of remembrance, commitments to justice, and theological exploration. The Holocaust, arguably the most profound rupture in modern Jewish history, stands as both a symbol of unimaginable evil and a catalyst for renewed moral urgency. Out of the ashes of that catastrophe rose not only the modern state of Israel, but also a global Jewish discourse centered on human rights, ethical responsibility, and the sanctity of life. Museums, education programs, and memorials were established, not to dwell on victimhood, but to warn future generations of the consequences of silence and indifference. This transformative approach has its roots deep in Jewish tradition. The Talmud teaches that when the temple was destroyed, study became a form of worship, and when sovereignty was lost, memory became a form of resistance. This reframing of loss into purpose has made the Jewish people unusually resilient. Even their humor, self-deprecating philosophical dark, reflects an ability to process pain without being consumed by it. Where others might see defeat, Jewish tradition sees opportunity for reflection and renewal. This doesn't mean romanticizing suffering, but rather refusing to let it have the final word. The emphasis is always on continuity, on life, on rebuilding. Every broken glass at a wedding, every fast day for a fallen temple, every whispered Kaddish for the dead, all serve as threads in a tapestry that says, we are still here and we still believe in tomorrow. And yet, the question remains, can this ancient civilization, so rooted in memory and tradition, continue to thrive in a world so fundamentally different from the one in which it was born? The threats of assimilation, secularism, and ideological fragmentation are real. In parts of the diaspora, Jewish identity is increasingly diluted into broad cultural gestures, bagels over blessings, ancestry kits over aliyah. Birth rates in some communities are dangerously low, and the intergenerational transmission of faith is weakening. In Israel, political polarization and conflicts over religious authority threaten national unity. The challenges are vast, but so too are the resources. Jewish history is filled with moments where the end seemed near, whether during Babylonian captivity, the fall of Masada, the Inquisition, or the ghettos of Europe, and yet each time something new emerged from the ruins. The key has never been nostalgia or rigidity, but creative adaptation grounded in timeless principles. Judaism has always had the remarkable ability to evolve without losing itself. New movements have emerged: Hasidism, Reform, Modern Orthodoxy, Renewal, each seeking to answer the perennial question of how to live a Jewish life in a changing world. Technology, once feared, is now harnessed for global Torah study, digital communities, and instant connections between Jews from Tel Aviv to Toronto. There is a growing awareness, especially among younger Jews, that identity is not inherited but chosen, and that choosing to remain Jewish in the 21st century is an act of meaning, not just memory. It is a declaration that even now, in an age of distraction and division, there are still values worth preserving, questions worth asking, and a covenant worth upholding. The future of Jewish civilization may not lie in reclaiming past glories or merely preserving old customs, but in reimagining its role in a rapidly transforming world. It must continue doing what it has always done best, turning instability into insight, exile into evolution, and memory into moral compass. In a world dominated by fleeting trends, shallow attention, and algorithmic thinking, the Jewish tradition offers something enduring, a demand to ask better questions, to live intentionally, and to find sacredness even in the mundane. The Shabbat table, with its candles, challah, and songs, is more than ritual. It is a protest against a culture of speed. The Torah study group is more than academic exercise. It is a community of seekers confronting eternal questions. Jewish life doesn't offer easy answers, but it does offer a language and framework for wrestling with complexity. This is its secret strength. The survival of the Jews has never been about physical dominance, but about spiritual tenacity and intellectual honesty. And today, when the world feels more uncertain than ever, facing environmental crisis, political instability, and existential dread, this tradition of questioning, remembering, and rebuilding is not just relevant, it's necessary. As other systems falter, the Jewish model of ethical continuity, communal resilience, and deep learning can serve as a guide for anyone seeking to live meaningfully in a fractured age. This isn't to say that the Jews are morally superior or cosmically chosen in the simplistic sense. It is to acknowledge that they have walked longer through history's storms and still carry a torch that lights the way forward, not just for themselves, but for anyone willing to see. In the end, Jewish history is not merely a chronicle of survival, but a living testimony to the power of meaning in the face of chaos. It reminds us that identity can be fluid without being lost, that tradition can evolve without becoming obsolete, and that even the smallest group, armed not with swords but with stories, can shape the destiny of civilizations. The Jewish people have spent millennia balancing the weight of the past with the pull of the future, carrying with them a legacy of exile and return, despair and renewal. This story is not one of unbroken triumph, but of refusal to disappear, and that refusal is profoundly human. It says, "We remember not to be trapped, but to transcend. We believe not because it's easy, but because the world without belief is unbearable. We continue not because we are certain, but because we are committed." For all its divisions, contradictions, and struggles, the Jewish civilization stands as a symbol of what it means to live with intention and purpose, even when the odds seem impossible. It invites the world to consider that the deepest form of resilience is not just to endure, but to endure with dignity, to suffer and still sing, to be broken and still bless. As the Jewish people move into their 5th millennium, their legacy is not written only in stone or scroll, but in the choices of each generation to carry forward the fire. And so the story continues, not as an ending, but as an invitation to remember, to rebuild, and to believe that even now, in the noise of a fractured world, a quiet voice of purpose can still be heard. Now I'd love to hear from you. What did this story make you feel? What part struck you the most? Drop a comment below. I read everyone. Your feedback not only helps shape the next videos, but keeps this conversation alive, just like the stories we've explored today.